I am a 17-year-old boy currently living in Ciudad del Valle, a quiet town in northern Mexico. What I am about to share happened a few months ago when I took an overnight trip through the Sierra Nevada mountains, about an hour's drive from where I live. I will not reveal the exact name of the trail, as I have learned that doing so always attracts curious people who end up crowding the place, bringing with them noise and trash. The trail I chose to follow was a loop of approximately 13 kilometers through a canyon, a relatively easy path ideal for a day trip. Initially, I planned to go with a friend, but due to a last-minute cancellation, I ended up going alone, with my backpack packed and the car gassed up. Although I left later than planned, I continued on alone. I had difficulty finding the correct path through the narrow forest trails and ended up arriving at the starting point around 5:45 p.m. This was a big mistake, especially for someone who is used to hiking, because I had about 6 kilometers to go to the place where I planned to set up camp. Night was falling quickly, and I knew that if I hurried, I would be able to make it 4 or 5 kilometers before I had to look for a place to set up my tent. This plan left me walking alone and in the dark, with about 24 kilometers of dirt road separating me from any help. Walking in the dark alone is a terrifying feeling, especially knowing where I was. Eventually, the darkness became so thick that I could only see what the flashlight strapped to my head could illuminate. That's when I decided it was time to stop and set up camp. Using only the light from the flashlight, which barely illuminated the surrounding area, I looked for a place to set up the tent. I ended up finding a less than ideal spot, but with some traces of burned wood and a circle of stones, indicating that someone had camped there before. It wasn't recent, but it seemed safe. My immediate goal was to start a fire. After some searching, I found enough dry wood to make a fire. With the fire going, I set up my tent and prepared a simple dinner, a bowl of pasta with corned beef. As the food began to cook, I felt calmer, although I still had the same uneasy feeling that had accompanied me throughout the hike. Camping alone in an isolated area has that effect. To better understand what happened next, I need to explain how I set up my camp. I chose a small clearing surrounded by tall pine trees, with the trail about 30 feet to my left. When you are in such a spot, with a fire burning, it creates a circle of light around you, while everything outside of that circle is plunged into total darkness. I was sitting on the ground near the fire, enjoying my meal, when suddenly a small rock the size of a marble was thrown toward my campsite. I froze in shock, for I was certain that I was the only person on the trail that night. Instinctively, I pointed my flashlight in the direction the rock had come from, but due to the density of the pine trees and bushes, I could only see about 10 feet away. I spent the next 15 minutes in complete shock, scanning the trees around me, trying to figure out where the rock could have come from, not daring to stray too far from the light of the campfire, which in retrospect gave me a false sense of security. After a while, I managed to convince myself that perhaps the rock had fallen from a tree or that I had kicked it myself without realizing it. With this thought, I went to sleep, not knowing what awaited me that night. I was awakened by the soft sound of leaves rustling, barely audible but present. At first, I thought the sound was moving away from me. I reached for my handheld flashlight, which I had left beside me when I went to bed, but to my surprise, it was no longer there. Fear began to grow within me as I searched around, but could not find it. I quickly got out of my sleeping bag, crawled out from under the tarp, and began searching. It was then that I spotted a light in the distance, between the trees, no more than 4 meters away from me. It was my flashlight, lying on the ground in a pile of leaves. This was one of the scariest moments of my life, and I felt myself losing control. The flashlight I had left beside me a few hours earlier was now a short distance away, beyond the tree line, in the forest. I quickly pulled on my boots, grabbed my machete, and began to weigh my options. Should I wait here and let the night pass, or should I try to make my way back to the car, hiking the 5 kilometers of dark trail? I realized that if I went out on the trail without a light, whoever was there with me would have a much greater advantage. I decided to stay in the forest. I set up camp and waited. I heard footsteps in the woods, but they were distant, as if someone were walking calmly, without hurrying. Sometimes the footsteps would disappear, but after an hour, or maybe two, they would return, always with the same calm rhythm. This went on for 3 or 4 hours, until the footsteps got closer and closer, until they were about 2.5 meters away from me. By this time, the campfire was almost out, as I had used all the wood available. The footsteps stopped, and everything was completely silent. I stood still for another 2 hours, holding the machete tightly, praying that nothing else would happen. Finally, as the sunlight began to appear, I realized that I was alone. Quickly, dismounting everything, I began to walk back along the 5-kilometer trail I had traveled. When I finally reached the dirt road where my car was parked, I ran to it, unlocked the car and drove without stopping, putting 32 kilometers between me and that place. I stopped at a gas station in town to buy an energy drink, but more than that, I wanted to see and talk to other people. As I left the store, I noticed something written in the dust on the back window of my car. Sleep tight. I've had many strange experiences during my travels, but nothing was as bizarre and terrifying as this one. I decided to share this story because I believe that someone or something is really disturbing in the Sierra Nevada mountains. If you can, stay the hell away from there. If you liked the story, subscribe to the channel for more content like this and share it with your friends. Many more chilling stories are to come. I want to share a story that I have never been able to get out of my mind. I am an amateur photographer, and after working in jobs that did not satisfy me for a long time, I decided to dedicate myself full-time to photography. I've always been passionate about capturing nature, and it was this passion that drove me to take this step. At first, I was worried about being able to support myself with this alone, but the desire to make a living from my art was greater than the fear of failure. Photographing landscapes has always been my forte, and I've managed to make it my profession. I recently secured an interesting job, a several-hour drive to the starting point, followed by a little-known trail that would take 3 days on foot to the ideal location for the photos. I thought it would be interesting to have a friend to accompany me, someone who knew the region, but he already had other commitments. I ended up going alone, something that at the time seemed like a calm decision. The destination was a remote spot located between 2 countries on the border of a huge mountain range. The trail was challenging, and the walk through rough terrain and dense forest made the journey even more difficult. But that didn't bother me. I've always enjoyed a challenge, and I knew that difficulty made the work more worthwhile. The scenery was stunning, with waterfalls and majestic mountains at every turn. It seemed that in every direction I looked, there was a scene worthy of being photographed. As the sun began to set, I decided to set up camp for the first night. I was exhausted, but also excited by the photos I had captured. I fell asleep quickly, but the next day brought me a new level of difficulty. The trail became increasingly demanding, but the views became more rewarding. I was in a place untouched by man, where the only sounds were the wind in the trees and the birdsong. I began to feel an immense loneliness, something that seemed at odds with my love of nature. The feeling was contradictory because although I knew I was taking a risk, there was no turning back. The sun was setting, and I was already starting to set up camp for that night. I decided to explore the surrounding area a little more before settling in. That's when I heard something. Footsteps. At first I thought it was an animal, but I soon realized that the sound was more peculiar. It sounded like something dragging on the ground, and the steady march was coming towards me. The sound got closer and closer, and as I looked through the trees, I saw something that left me completely astonished. There was a woman walking through the forest. She looked to be about 50 years old, wearing a long white dress, but what struck me most was the fact that she was wearing high heels. Her hair was perfectly styled, as if she were going to a party, and she was wearing makeup. The strangest thing was that she was not carrying a backpack, equipment, or any sign of preparation for a hike like mine. She only carried a small white bag, which matched her dress, which dragged behind her as she walked calmly along the trail. I stood there watching, completely unsure of how to react. I wanted to offer help, but something told me that she was there for a reason, that she belonged there. It was a feeling that was hard to explain, something that didn't make sense, but that I couldn't deny. She walked slowly through the forest until she disappeared into the trees without making another sound. I stood there for a few minutes, still in shock, until the sun began to set completely. I took advantage of the little light left to return to camp and light the fire. I spent the rest of the night around the fire reflecting on what I had just seen. Part of me hoped she would return, but she never appeared again. Day broke, and I began the journey back along the trail. My mind was far away, trying to find a rational explanation for what had happened. After all, how could she have gotten there without any equipment, without food or water? And how could she have walked for 3 days through that terrain in high heels? I may never understand what happened. I even tried to take a picture of her, but the moment was so strange and fleeting that nothing turned out as expected. The image of her disappearing into the forest remains with me to this day as a disturbing memory. Have you ever experienced something like this, something impossible to explain? What would you do in my place? I would love to hear your opinion in the comments. And now, let's move on to the next story. When I was 15, I had an experience I will never forget. I was camping on a secluded property in western Maryland where several of my mother's families had small cabins. We were in the middle of nowhere on private land, and the only company we had were our relatives. Everyone on the mountain was family in some way. During the summers, we would gather around a campfire, telling scary stories and playing games with our cousins. To understand how the place was laid out, imagine a path shaped like a T. Just above the T, about 150 feet away, was the Sabaj River. If you went left, you would find the houses of the various families, as well as a dense forest. If you went right, you would come to my mother's small cabin, where we stayed. I had always enjoyed exploring the area alone, seeking solitude, until my aunt, 13 years older than me, decided to accompany me. She was an outgoing woman with pink hair and several tattoos, and at 6 feet tall, she was not easily intimidated. She suggested we go left toward the dense forest, and I agreed. She said she wanted to smoke away from my grandmother, who did not approve of such things. Being a more well-behaved boy, I declined the offer to try drugs, but my curiosity to explore the area was greater. At the end of the path, we found a dirt trail that went deep into the forest, with the river running 150 feet above us. If we continued toward the river, the trail descended into a slope, and a few miles later, we came across those mysterious stairs that led nowhere. We decided to follow the trail along the river, watching the fish and crabs that swam hurriedly by. My aunt followed me closely while I was lost in thought. It was then that the click of a camera broke my concentration. I looked up in confusion, and on the other side of the river, about 15 feet away, I saw a man I'd never seen before. He looked like he had just stepped out of the woods, and although it was summer, he was wearing a black jacket and old jeans. He was holding an old-fashioned camera, the kind that wasn't digital and had to be rotated to take another picture. I was surprised because I had never seen anyone other than my family around here in all the years we had been there. The man smiled, raised the camera, and calmly pointed it at me. He looked to be in his 40s, tall and thin, with a slovenly appearance. When he stepped forward, I instinctively took a step back. He rotated the top of the camera and took another picture while I was completely speechless. My aunt then appeared, stumbling through the trees and talking about how much she missed being high. She stopped when she saw the man, but I continued to stare at him as if I were paralyzed. He wasn't looking at my aunt, his eyes were fixed on me. The man took another photo and then did something that made my blood run cold. He made a disapproving gesture with his finger and pointed to a knife sheath strapped to his waist. Then he slid his finger across his neck, simulating a cut. At that moment, I went into automatic mode. I grabbed my aunt's hand and started running through the trees, my heart racing. I could have sworn I heard another click of the camera before I heard footsteps in the water behind us. My leg shook so much it felt like it was going to collapse. The river, which was quite deep in some parts, only came up to our thighs. I ran aimlessly, like an animal fleeing from a predator. When we saw the stairs, my aunt quickly pulled me to the other side and crouched down next to me, covering my mouth to keep us from making any noise. I looked around, but the forest was so dense that I couldn't see the river or the stairs. With my heart still pounding, I began to hear branches snapping, as if someone were running through the forest. Fear took hold of me, and the way back to my family's property seemed increasingly difficult. The path back was not straight and easy. We had to zigzag, and the terrain often sank or became rocky, requiring us to take an S-shaped route. The area was also infested with snakes, which made us even more alert. My breathing was heavy, and I knew that we had a long way to go until we reached the first part of the property. The adrenaline was still driving me, but my mind was racing, trying to process what was happening. In the middle of the rush, I tripped over a branch and hit my head on a tree. I tasted blood as I bit my lip as I fell. I was dazed, but the adrenaline pushed me to drag myself to a tree. My aunt, realizing I was no longer right behind, came running back and knelt down beside me, whispering to me to hurry up. I was in shock, shaking with fear, and she knew we couldn't waste any more time. She pulled me along urgently, and I managed to follow, limping as fast as I could. The rest of the way out of the woods was a blur of fear and panic. When we finally emerged from the woods, most of my family was gone, so we ran to my grandmother's house. There, I ran inside, sobbing. We didn't lock the doors there, but my grandmother looked at me in fright, and my aunt was equally cut and terrified. She screamed for my grandfather, who quickly grabbed his rifle. Unsure of what had really happened, I let my aunt explain. My grandmother and grandfather went through the cabins, rounding up the men with guns, while alerting the women and children to what had happened. There was no cell phone signal, so calling the sheriff was not an option. The road to the property was so winding and steep that trying to drive up at night would have been madness. Later, my mother arrived, looked at me and then at my aunt, suggesting that I might have done drugs with her, which made us even more paranoid. When we saw a fisherman in the area without a permit, we made rash assumptions, scaring him as much as he scared us. My mother insisted that I probably assumed the man was taking pictures or that we were being followed. My aunt was outraged and yelled at my mother, insisting that we were telling the truth. The two began to argue until my grandmother stopped them, telling them to stop fighting. The men in the family searched the woods, but found no sign of the man. However, that night, for the first time in many years, everyone locked their doors. To this day, all I wonder is if the man was part of some collection of creepy photos. And considering what could have happened, perhaps if I had been alone, as I usually am, I could have handled it better.